The metaverse is emerging as the next big technology platform and promises to be the next frontier for human experiences on the internet. Into the Metaverse covers companies, technologies, and trends that are bringing these promises to life. Join creator and host Jonathan Ross-Friedman, founder and CEO of Supersocial, as he interviews the brilliant minds that are building, shaping, and investing in the Metaverse.
Welcome to episode 26 of Into the Metaverse, where we help make sense of the Metaverse through deep interviews with the brilliant minds who build, create for, and invest in the Metaverse. I'm Jan, and joining me today is Sam Huber, CEO of LandVault, a company that helps brands establish presence in blockchain-based Metaverse-type platforms such as Sandbox and Decentraland. The company was previously called AdMix, rebranded after a merger to accelerate AdMix's entry into Web3. Previously, AdMix allowed content creators to monetize real estate within their games via product placements. Today, LandVault raised over $37 million in funding from venture capital firms such as Elephant, Notion Capital, and Speed Invest, among others. Sam, virtual land is a hot topic. Super delighted to welcome you on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
As always, just a quick disclaimer, everything discussed on the podcast is not a financial advice. Content is strictly educational. So, Sam, let's dig in. As we continue to build an evolving consensus around what the metaverse is, the first question I ask always every guest on the show is, what is the metaverse for you, for LandVault, and actually also what it is not?
Yeah, I mean, we have a pretty simple definition. We think that the metaverse is no less than the next generation of the internet, which is born from the convergence of two huge forces, one of them being gaming technologies. Gaming is obviously a $180 billion industry. Most of the population that is connected to the internet games one way or another, 3 billion gamers every month. So that's a huge trend that is happening anyway. And then you have the blockchain, which is one of the fastest ever growing technology. Obviously, we hear a lot about the prices that are up and down, but this is short-term noise. The technology is there. It's used by a lot of Fortune 500 companies, and it has a $1 trillion market cap. And those two things are converging. And the convergence of these two things lead to what we believe is a moment in time where these technologies become mainstream and lead to the metaverse. And metaverse effectively is this new version of the internet, an immersive and decentralized version of the internet.
Amazing. Great definition. What do you think it's not?
Everything else. I mean, what it's not, so there's a few things that are commonly mistaken for the metaverse. One of them is a device. So people ask, oh, but is the metaverse VR or is it not? Like, it's the internet, right? That's the right analogy, is to think about it as the internet. And the internet you can consume on your phone, but also on your desktop, even on your TV. Like, the device doesn't matter. The internet can be consumed on different devices and create different experiences. The metaverse is the same. You right now mainly consume it on your desktop. You will be able to consume it in VR, which will be by far the most immersive and exciting way to consume it, but you don't have to have VR. And you'll also be able to consume it on your phone for a more kind of overview of the experience, less immersive. So that's one of the things that the metaverse is not, is a device. It's agnostic to that. Another thing would be the metaverse is not, well, the metaverse is the metaverse. There's not multiple metaverses. That's another thing that sometimes is confusing. There's not multiple versions of the internet. There's the internet, and on the internet, you have different websites or applications. It's the same in the metaverse. You have one metaverse, which is this basically 3D version of the internet, or this digital universe. Within that, you have different worlds, but there's only one metaverse. So I would say that this is probably the two things that people generally are not quite sure about. So that's what the metaverse is not.
That's great. I want to double click on the second point you said, because that's actually something that I've heard before. And to a large extent, I personally agree with that notion. There's only one internet. There are no multiple internets, even though, you know, there are parallel internets if you think about China and the Chinese wall, but it's still the same pretty much internet. They just chose to guard it. However, the internet was born in a different era when there's nothing else that was ever even resembling what the internet became. today we live in a world where the internet is proliferated around the world. And I think philosophically, I definitely agree with that notion that you shared as well, which is there is no multiple internets, and therefore there should not be multiple metaverses. Having said that, we have grown into a world where now on the internet, there are multiple really large scale platforms. And I think I definitely subscribe to that worldview where the metaverse is going to be ideally fully interoperable. People can carry their identity and their assets with them from one platform to another. However, it is a bit deterministic to think that this is just going to happen, and it might take time until it happens. And so my question to you is, do you think there is a chance where that ideal, fully open, fully interoperable metaverse may not happen, and in which case we do wake up into a world where there are multiple metaverse-type platforms, quote unquote, where there might be elements of the metaverse that lives within those platforms without necessarily the fully open, fully interoperable?
Yeah, the answer is yes. That's what I think will happen. And if you think about the Web2 equivalent, yes, the internet, there's only one, and you have standards like HTTP, it's respected, it's a standard that everyone built on top of. But if you think about where you spend your time, you would look at maybe Google, the Meta ecosystem with Facebook and Instagram and Amazon, and maybe a couple of other things. So while they're all interoperable, because you can click from one page to another, technically speaking, you still end up living in those silos, right? And your Google profile is not something you can export and re-import into your Facebook profile. So yes, there is an element of interoperability because of the standards and the hyperlink and all that stuff. But there's also things that are siloed, right? You can't export your Instagram data, which for a lot of people is a big part of their life and how they express themselves, into Fortnite. And I think it's the exact same thing in Web3, where we have a base for interoperability, which is the blockchain. With the blockchain, you own your own assets. They're part of your wallet. They're not on the platform. So when you have your own NFTs and you log into Sandbox, the NFTs are being imported into Sandbox. Whether they can render in the Sandbox or not, that's a different issue, which is more of a graphical issue. But technically, your assets, you bring them with you on the blockchain. So there is an element of interoperability already. But then, as I said, there is a big difference between how graphics look on Sandbox and on Decentraland, and therefore importing a pixelated sword into a more photorealistic environment just doesn't really make sense. So I think it's the same concept, that there are elements of interoperability, but there are still challenges. And I think most of the challenges right now are around the user experience and the graphics that are just different between those platforms. And therefore, importing assets from one to another is difficult. Having said that, I also don't think that the metaverse needs to be interoperable, fully interoperable to be successful. I think it would be the ideal choice. It would be amazing to be in one world and you can always go somewhere else and bring your assets with you. But again, the internet, Web2, by its own standards, has been very successful in terms of adoption and revenue and all of that. And again, you can't import your Instagram profile into TikTok. So it's fine, technically, for the sake of the internet and for the sake of the metaverse. Interoperability, in my view, is not something that is absolutely necessary for it to succeed, at least not at the beginning.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there, and we're going to get back to that later in the conversation. But for now, I want to switch gear and talk a bit about the work you guys are doing at LandVault. And so would love if you can share with the listeners, what is really LandVault's mission? What is your vision for where you guys are going? And how do you believe it will impact businesses, creators, and consumers?
Yeah, we are very passionate about Web3 generally. We think that Web3 gives the internet a chance to redistribute its wealth in a way that is more fair. The Web2 internet obviously has been a very successful platform, and a lot of people have gotten rich and were able to find jobs, and it's definitely working. But if you look at the amount of value generated, we're talking about trillions of dollars a year in commerce. A big fraction of that aggregates to only a few platforms. So it's definitely been a positive thing for the world, but the way that the resources have been split and shared it's very much geared towards the big platforms who then build network effects and it's just impossible not to compete. I think that's been the case because those platforms made the most of the rules that were built in the late 90s. So of course they leveraged the rules that were available to them and they did very well for themselves. But I think this will not change unless there is a revolution that happens and new rules for the internet. And I think Web3 is the promise of new rules because of that blockchain backend that is essentially decentralizes the ownership of virtual goods, meaning that if you create something, you can retain ownership or at least the right for future payment on this item. And that changes everything. Because if you think about it, the current internet, a lot of the platform have been effectively fueled or built by the users, right? User generated content. That's the transition really from Web 1 to Web 2. And this is when the web started to grow exponentially because everyone could become a creator. But the value still went to the platforms that hosted this, not the individual creators. So imagine if people could retain not necessarily the whole thing, but a fraction of what they had created. I think we would have elevated, instead of elevating a handful of companies from billion-dollar status to trillion-dollar status, we would have elevated the internet population more in a fairer way. So anyway, we see that Web3 is the very first time where that opportunity is finally available to redistribute the wealth of the internet. So our very long-term vision is to contribute to that somehow. We think it would be a good thing for the world if the wealth that is generated on the internet could be redistributed more fairly between participants. How do we do that? And we think that the best way to do that is by accelerating the metaverse economy, which is basically our mission statement. And the reason for that is because in this new world, a lot of the interaction or what we call the application layer, where users will interact with the world, we think is going to be the metaverse. So the metaverse is this user interface of Web3, the way we see it. This is where the actual interactions will happen, which is where your NFT portfolio will come to life, where you'll have interactions. And so in order to get there, now we're getting to the what of what we do today, we have a very simple solution, which is basically a one-stop shop for users, for brands, for IP, for celebrities who want to enter the metaverse. Entering the metaverse, there's still barriers to entry, right? You need to understand how to navigate it. There's an element of virtual land in Web3 on those platforms. You need to own land or lease land. So we provide that service as a step one. Then we build experiences on top of that land. We now have about 130 full-time designers, builders, voxel editors, game developers that can basically translate any idea or concept or vision into an experience in the metaverse. And then step three, critically, is how do you turn those experiences into a profitable business? Because if we want people to keep coming, if we want brands to keep investing, there's going to need some kind of return on investment, right? Otherwise, it's just going to remain a marketing platform. But we want people to invest in the metaverse just like they invest in an e-commerce website. This is not a marketing play. You're going to make money from it. You're going to sell product. The cost of building the sites are very quickly going to be overtaken by the money that you're making. So we want the metaverse to become a profitable business for people who enter it. And this is why the AdMix legacy technology, which is a product placement technology, is one of our core products. We're building other products as well around e-commerce, around fractionalization of experiences, basically giving creators more tools to monetize the content that they have created. So this is the really critical piece here. There are a lot of people buying land. There's a lot of people building, not as big as LandVault, but there's a lot of creators. But the critical part is how do you monetize this experience? How do you turn this into a business? And not just for big brands, but for individuals, creators, or you could do your podcast there and monetize it in a different way by turning it into an NFT and selling individual clips, right? So there's a business model for everyone. And these are the things that we're exploring. And it's still very early, but to date, we've done over 200 builds so far. Big brands like MasterCard, Heineken, L'Oreal, but also Web3 brands. World of Women, our experience is about to go live in the Sandbox, a derivative of the Bored Ape for the mutant, Mega Mutant. So we've really been covering a wide range of brands and IP that wanted to enter the metaverse and providing a full-on solution for them.
Okay, so thank you for that. There's a lot to unpack. There's a few things I want to double click on. The first one is and we're going to talk about virtual land in a few minutes because I think that's in and of itself an important topic to unpack. But before that, when you think about the value chain of the reason why the metaverse is important and why what happened with Web 2 is challenging, from the consumer side, and I know with Web 2, it was the first time the consumer and creators essentially became one and the same, right? If it's on Facebook or if it's on TikTok and YouTube, right? A lot of the users actually also create content and they don't really monetize, especially on a platform like Facebook. We've been creating content probably for the last 15 years on the platform that ultimately didn't generate even a single cent for ourselves as effectively content creators. So that's one piece of issue that platforms like Facebook, although there are Web 2 platforms that provides monetization opportunities, sometimes primarily through advertising, but there's definitely the creator piece that Web 3 is potentially solving with regards to how can we enable creators to monetize in new ways beyond advertising that then impacts the overall experience. I do want to hear your point of view on how is Web 3 and why is Web 3 important in the context of the metaverse for consumers. I think that's an important piece of what is really going to be potentially the impact for just not even people who create content or are looking to monetize content within the metaverse or Web 3. And so I would love to pick your key takeaways on when we talk about the ability to own and carry your identity with you, to own and carry your assets with you. Why is that going to be important for quote unquote normal users of the internet in the future?
Yeah, I think again, it comes down to ownership, right, of digital goods. And I don't mean that on the point of like the philosophical point of I want to own my items, but literally there's a financial benefit to that. So, individual users that will take part in a Web3 experience could be rewarded for the actions that they are taking in that world. I think that the fundamental difference between Web 2 and Web 3 is we are shifting from an attention economy to an ownership economy. So in Web 2, on most websites, on most applications in Web 2, the currency is attention. You attract traffic on your website, on your application, and then you figure out a way to monetize it. Sometimes it's through advertising, sometimes by converting people, but it all starts with attention. You need people on that experience, on that application, and then you figure out a way to monetize that. And as a user, you don't get any part of that. Now, I'm not a fundamentalist of Web3 saying Web 2 is terrible. I mean, Web 2 works and it's great and we have the internet. I see Web 3 as an improvement that is now made possible by the blockchain. What if, in addition from being the product effectively on those social network or those applications where effectively the platform makes money from your data, what if you could also get upside as a user? And the more you use the platform, the more you get rewarded, which aligns your interest with the platform, because suddenly you incentivize to do more, which helps the platform as well, and everyone is pulling in the same direction. So I think Web3 to me creates this alignment of incentives between the platforms that build the applications and the users in a way that we haven't seen before, because right now it was them between us, or even if creators get rewarded with the revenue share, the problem is not that the revenue share is big enough. The problem is that if the creator gets more, then the platform gets less. So there's already a conflict of interest there. And eventually the platform is going to decrease their commission to the creators. They always do. They move from attraction to extraction. Now in Web3, because there's a concept of incentive through tokens, everyone has tokens. The platform holds tokens. They reward the users with tokens. And what everyone wants is the token to increase in price. So suddenly everyone is incentivized by the same thing. Everyone is pulling in the same direction. And to me, to create long-term value, you need to have this alignment of incentives between the different stakeholders. But to come back to the question, so we're coming from an attention economy where basically our attention is sold to the highest bidder and monetized by the platforms. And in Web3, we're moving that to an ownership economy, meaning that by contributing with your attention, you get to own pieces of the platforms. the tokens, for example, but it could also be assets that you build, or it could be land. Whatever asset that is part of the platform are now things that are open to the retail investor that you can buy. So the users are moving from being spectators to being shareholders of the platforms. So if the platform does well, or if you own a few coins, a few tokens, or if you own a couple of assets, or if you own land, then you will do well as well. Again, alignment of incentives. When Facebook does well, unless you are a shareholder, which is limited to accredited investors and all of that, it doesn't make a difference to you. So to me, that's the real difference for consumers, is that it's going to be a much easier entry point for them to be bought in to the platforms that they like, that they support, that they create on, that they consume on, and therefore participate in the financial success on those platforms as well, in a way that just wouldn't be possible without the blockchain.
So philosophically, I agree with you. I think I have a slightly, I wouldn't say provocative point of view, maybe just a slightly different point of view, where I agree that for creators, there is no doubt that the economic system needs to be different for creators to not only enjoy the financial upside from the emergence of popular platforms, but actually be significant participants in that economic upside. And I think Web3 technologies definitely create potentially an infrastructure, a technological infrastructure that allows that to happen. Having said that, on the consumer side, I think it's, and I might be wrong, but I think time will tell, right, where it really goes. I think on the consumer side, I find it to be a bit more challenging, because I think there is the behavioral thing where since the dawn of really any medium, if it's radio or TV, our attention as consumers have been monetized forever now, right? Through radio advertising, when we're watching TV, what is commercials on TV if not monetizing our eyeballs, right? Sure. And we're not, as consumer, get any upside economically from that. However, also the creators don't get anything, right? I would love to see a TV network that actually give a piece of the advertising revenue to the creators of the TV shows. That doesn't happen either. And so I believe that the low-hanging fruit of Web3, to your point, is really the economic incentives for creators. And that makes a lot of sense because creators want to build businesses. So the money aspect matters to them. What I'm uncertain of, and I think the financialization of the internet makes it even more complex, is what does it mean for consumers? And do consumers are actually going to care and think about how do they potentially, quote unquote, make money from being a user or a platform participant? And I don't know the answer. I think you have a point of view which is clear, and I think time will tell.
I think it's a combination of making, you can go to a platform where you don't make money and your data gets compromised and there's ads everywhere. Or you can go to a platform where you make a little bit of money. It might not be much depending on your contribution, and it's pretty much anonymous. And because of the new business models for creators, there's less need to overload the experience with bad advertising. So to me, it's going to be a fairly simple choice that consumers are making. Obviously, I'm not saying that Web3 is going to completely replace everything in Web2. I also don't think that the metaverse and the immersive nature of it is going to replace the traditional internet. If you want to shop for groceries, or if you want to do a bank transfer with your friends, you don't need a 3D decentralized interface for this, right? It's not everything, but there are things, mainly the experiential things, whether it's shopping or discovering product or watching videos or hanging out with friends. There are things that are just better in 3D. That would just be better if it was a little bit more immersive. And all the creative tasks, whether it's creating content, text, video, images, 3D, all of this stuff could be done better if the creator had more incentives. So I think there's a big segment of the kind of creative class of the internet that is going to move towards Web3, and that's going to attract an audience that is also going to have this value exchange. Either they spend time on the traditional internet or they spend time consuming this great content in Web3. So the audience will come because the content is great. And as LandVault, as the largest builders, we see a big responsibility for us to also build fun experiences, not just for brands, but something that actually appeals to people and that keeps them in the experience for longer.
That's a great springboard to the next item I wanted to talk about, which is brands. And so It is clear that some of the platforms that are metaverse type platforms today that are running on blockchain to some extent, if it's Sandbox, Decentraland, and I know there are others as well, but I'm just calling out these kind of two examples. They're obviously at the very nascent stage of development. And so you guys are working very closely with a lot of brands. When brands come to you and having these conversations about building their presence in platforms like that, what are they looking for, and what are the guidance that you're giving them with the understanding that the space is really at a very nascent stage?
Yeah, that's basically the first question we asked them, and that evolved quite a bit over time already. At the beginning of this year, brands just wanted to be in. Mainly it was because of FOMO, because they've seen a competitor, they wanted to be the first, and they felt like they were already missing the boat by not getting in. This has quieted down a little bit, which is great. We have a meaningful request, I would say. Now brands that want in have a Web3 strategy, they have a Web3 working group. So it's a lot more thoughtful in what they want to achieve. And the interesting thing is like their motivations are not different from any other investment that they would make, which is it's either about increasing awareness, or it's about increasing engagement, or it's about increasing sales. So it's all the way down the funnel, from the top of the funnel all the way down, which is what they should be doing. Nothing else really matters, right? At the end of the day, if you're a brand, if you're a shop, you need to increase awareness, and eventually that leads to increase sales. So I think what's interesting is that there are a few case studies, whether it's the Adidas experience that sold $24 million of NFTs, or the Fashion Week, which generated also millions of dollars across 60 plus brands. There are tangible results from those brands. That's what I think is exciting about a medium like the metaverse, the decentralized metaverse, as opposed to a TikTok or an Instagram, which was very top funnel. There's no monetization directly integrated within the platform. You need to become popular, you need to work with influencers, eventually you might sell product. But in the metaverse, you have the financial engine. The blockchain is there. It's made to sell things directly from the experience. And those things also are NFTs that become part of the blockchain. So actually there is a tangible benefit for brands to do that today. And they see that this is not just about awareness or PR or fun, but there is a transactional backbone that is built into the experience. So more and more brands are waking up to this. And our view at LandVault is we're not building experiences, but we're building businesses, because we have all these monetization tools. And so a lot of the KPIs that we have, which they're around tangible results, number of people that come in, purchases that might be measured for a long time in the future, because the audience right now is still nascent, but that's definitely what we are trying to optimize for.
So there is one of the three items you've mentioned around the business of LandVault, and the first item actually you've mentioned was the land. And so there is a lot of conversation these days about virtual land and the speculative nature of the asset, including from famous entrepreneurs like Mark Cuban and others who are saying that it's utterly nonsense. And so let's put that popular statements aside and focus on substance. More importantly, there are many who really just genuinely question the value, also the common sense of why would we have a scarce virtual land? Why would we limit the amount of quote unquote land in the metaverse? Because isn't the whole point would be to ensure that anyone at any point around the world can create for the next frontier of the internet?
Yeah, I think overall there are multiple platforms that have taken different strategies. I think from their own, economic benefit, there is definitely an interesting model to reduce the supply. Because the way I think about this concept of land being valuable or not, first of all, people always say, okay, it can be infinite, therefore it's not valuable. But I think that argument just doesn't make much sense to me, because if you look at the internet, the number of websites on the internet is a couple billions, and it increased by 500,000 every day. So effectively, it's infinite, right? You can always create more websites. Does that make the main website like google.com less valuable? No, of course not, because it's not about the number of websites, just like it's not about the number of pieces of land. That's not the right KPI to look at. What matters is not the land, it's the audience that is on top of the land. That's what creates the value, right? Because once you have the audience, you can monetize with advertising, you can sell product, the experience becomes popular, Like an empty piece of land is useless. So I could recreate a version of Facebook tomorrow. Like, it's not that difficult to build a social network technically. What's difficult is to attract the audience. And if I build my own version of Facebook tomorrow, no one's going to be there. It's not going to be valuable. So again, it's not about replicating land. Of course, you can replicate land, but what matters is what you build on top of that land that's going to attract the audience. And the number of good builders is limited. The number of quality experience that people are attracted about is limited. So there is scarcity built in anyway, not by the number of pieces of land, but by the fact that people will aggregate around the best experiences anyway. So the argument that because land can be replicated, it doesn't have value, that's the internet has proven that this is not the case. Otherwise, websites will have no value. So that's one thing. And then
the second point was about the fact that, for example, today, if I want to build on Decentraland as a brand, I need to get access to a land, right? And so I need to either lease the land or buy the land. And don't you think that is, I'm just putting out the question from folks. Wouldn't you imagine that's counter to actually popularizing the metaverse and allowing more people to come in versus limiting my ability as a brand to figure out where do I buy land? And there's some platforms where there's very few land owners essentially. And it's almost like mimicking in a way the real world where you do have scarce land for a very good reason, by the way, because Earth is finite. It's not infinite. But in the virtual realm, there's no reason why those lands will be finite. And so do you imagine that some of the most important platforms will continue to be those with scarce land availability? Or do you believe, again, as a point of view, as a company builder in the space, that these should be open? There should not be any limitation because anyone should be able, just like with a website, to come in and try and build an incredible experience that will attract the highest number of users.
Yeah, I think the first thing you mentioned around Earth being scarce, there's an interesting stat that you could put the whole of the world's population in New Zealand, all of them, if you assume a density similar to New York City. So actually, there is a ton of space on the planet. There's just, again, aggregation of people around the areas where they want to live because no one really wants to live.
There's just very few people who will move from New York to New Zealand, correct?
Well, there's that. And also, no one wants to live in the middle of the desert, just like no one wants to be on the land in the metaverse where nothing happens. So there's always center of interest, right? Network effects form. The cities are the ultimate network effects. They attract people, which attract more people. Mm-hmm. There's always those point of aggregation that would happen, no matter if it's infinite. Then I think the element of leaving it open for everyone or having the concept of land is not hugely different in the way that I see it. Of course, there is an upfront cost to acquire land and to build on top of it. I think that cost means that this is a way for the platform to maintain high quality builds because by having people to commit to buy the land or to rent the land, you know that they're going to be serious about developing it because they've put an investment in. It's not just, it's a free piece of land. You can do whatever you want. So I think that was put in as a way to make sure that to curate the content and to really bring out the best content. That's one thing. I think the other thing also is that if you think about it, yes, right now on the internet, or let's take the example of Instagram, you can have an infinite number of websites, an infinite number of Instagram pages. But the way that people consume it is that they only see the same profiles, the same people. You know, not every website, not every Instagram page get the same amount of eyeballs. And a lot of that is due to algorithms, whether it's Google on the internet, whether it's Instagram itself recommending the most popular content. So in a way, the content that you consume is also limited to the top few who end up getting all the ad revenue and basically all the value from that huge audience. So in a sense, like what Land is doing that upfront by saying we're only going to have in the sandbox, it's 166,000 plots, which is effectively, that's the total consumable content. And then all the audience is going to have to split between those different parcels. So, you know, per parcel, you end up getting a huge amount of attention and potentially a huge amount of engagement and sales as well. It's like Instagram said, we're only going to have 160,000 accounts. You can imagine how much people would pay to be one of those accounts. Because on the other side, you have billion people that are scrolling through those accounts. But that's what's happening anyway with the algorithm. So I think it's just a different promotion mechanics that is more upfront, and it's basically a pay to play for sure. But at the end of the day, I don't think it really drastically changes the results, because I think the best creators, the most popular ones, the ones that people want to see, will end up on top of the algorithm anyway.
And how do you envision, because we were talking about the notion of platforms providing economic incentive or economic participation to the network itself. And so if I'm a landowner in Decentraland and there is an experience that monetizes, or multiple experiences that monetize inside a particular parcel that I own as a landowner in the metaverse, do you imagine that the economic upside from the rent from the project should be distributed across the creators, the participants, the users who are within that particular land or parcel? Because in and of itself, that almost becomes like a nano platform within a bigger platform.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, we are already doing that, but I'm suspecting others are doing it as well, right? You have the land. So the landowner, we own our own land, but we also work with other landowners. Then you have the creators that bring labor, they build the experience. And generally, this is funded by a brand that comes up with an idea and some capital as well. So you have those different factors of production by economic theory, which is land, labor, capital, and ideas. And with that, this is what you need to get a project off the ground. And all these different stakeholders, the one that contribute with the idea, the one that funded, the one that built it, the one that provide the land, should be rewarded. At the moment, this is basically an agreement that is done on a project by project basis. But something that we're launching soon is a product that is able to do that. And based on your inputs, based on what you put onto the table to get this project off the ground, you should get rewarded at a specific rate. Maybe you get 10% of the experience because you just came up with the idea. Maybe you get 50 because you build the whole thing. So absolutely, this is when I say we are accelerating the metaverse economy, that's basically what we're doing. We bring together the landowners, the creators, and the brands. These are the first three stakeholders in the metaverse. But right now, they don't talk to each other. I'm one of the first landowner in Somnium Space and other platforms, and I know a lot of other landowners. They have no idea. They're just sitting on their land to benefit from the capital gains, but they're not monetizing it. So they don't know where to find brands. And then the creators, they know how to build, but they might not have land, and they certainly don't know how to sell to a big brand. So again, they're not in contact. So LandVault is really this bridge between the landowner, the creators, and the brands, putting them together. And by creating the right tools to bridge the gap, this is how we actually start this economy and accelerate the economy of the metaverse.
Let's double click on the brands and experiences. One of the things, obviously, as a builder in this space as well, or anyone who creates consumer experiences, it is critical to build things people want to engage with. And I think one of the things that is happening at the moment, or at least even over the last year and a half, 2 years, with all the hype, people forgot that at the end of the day, we're talking about people who actually need to gain something. Could be fun, could be connection, could be opportunity to express yourself. But there needs to be some clear benefit that people would want to come. What are some of the successful use cases that you have seen, either as a participant in the platforms in general or as a builder in the space? What are some of the use cases of brand experiences or different type of games that you've seen being built on the platform that you feel like this is a good example of how things could be done right in this new frontier?
I think you're right that for some reason, the consumer has been left out of the narrative for some reason, right? We're talking about brands that are building something and landowners. Okay, that's great, but who is going to go there and why would they go there in the first place? It comes back to the main point that the metaverse really is a game with a business model. So at the core, you need an exciting game or exciting gaming mechanics, at least, which if it's done well, the gaming industry has proven that people would spend hours and hours engaging with the content. So it's really all about creating fun experiences that engage the users, that reward the users. There's been plenty of experiences, of examples of that. I think the fashion week in the metaverse, which we participated in, if you like fashion and you came here to discover digital fashion, this was a perfect place. This was not a mainstream event, but if that's what you were after, 60 brands were there. They were at different times, there were keynotes, so you could learn from the best in the space. They were doing fashion shows as well, where you could literally see digital fashion being created and being showcased in front of you, and then you could buy it and put it on top of your avatar. So it was the whole chain of value. And the numbers were pretty staggering. 70% of people actually ended up buying a digital asset, which was amazing. So if you came here with a purchase intent of digital fashion, this was an amazing event. There's plenty of other examples. I mean, to take our own activations, the World of Women activation, for example, is something that you can basically consume that world to get more context about the collection World of Women, which is a very famous NFT collection. And for a lot of NFT holders, seeing it in 2D OpenSea is one thing, but actually diving in that world of an IP that you love and that you're collecting, that just add extra context and makes you love the brand more without necessarily giving you anything tangible in return, but it's just a fun experience of actually understanding more about that world. And it's all about empowerment and things along those lines. So this was super successful. The MasterCard one, which was around Pride. MasterCard is a long-term supporter of Pride in New York, and they decided to extend that in the virtual world. So we built the whole Pride Plaza for them. We had influencers. We had, again, a lot of educational sessions, live events. Again, it's all centered around events. It's not anyone's cup of tea necessarily, but if you're interested in the space, if you want to learn more, then this was a great event, and this would not have been possible to do on the website. So I think it's all about bringing things that you cannot do outside of the metaverse, right? Being immersed in that crowd and dancing with other people and taking selfies of your digital self with your new fashion. Like, you can't do that on a website. And I think that uniqueness is really what drives people to consume those experiences.
So Sam, before we conclude this terrific conversation, what's the one thing you'd like the listeners to take away from our chat today?
I think the metaverse is going to happen anyway. A lot of people doubt that. I think it's like every technology revolution. There's an adoption curve. There is the hype cycle. Of course, we saw what happened with crypto, for example. But again, it's a trend that will sustain for sure. So I think the key here is to really is to engage with it, is to try to understand it. It doesn't mean that you have to spend your time in the metaverse right now. But a lot of people did not believe in the internet back in the 90s, and it took time for it to really take over. And now 20 years later, everyone is online. I think the metaverse is a trend that is also going to spread over the next couple of decades. And I think if you're a young person about to get your first job, or if you're a creator, it's really something that you should look into, because the upside of being early have been proven to be sizable. So that's all. That's, I guess, the message is to remain open and not discard the technology based on a few bad actors, a few bad articles, because the fundamentals, again, are very strong.
Remain open, build, experiment, and let's create a future that we all get excited about. Sam, thank you so much for joining me today. It was awesome.
Thanks for having me, man.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Into the Metaverse. We hope you learned a lot and explored new aspects of the metaverse.